Hello, everyone. I am Ben Johnson, and this is the Perpetual Chess Podcast. Perpetual Chess is a weekly chess interview show where we talk with accomplished chess players, authors, and personalities about their lives, their careers, and how to improve at chess. Perpetual Chess is brought to you through the generosity of its Patreon and PayPal supporters and by Chessable.com. Hello, everyone. It is good to be back. Welcome back to Perpetual Chess. We have another returning guest joining us this week, one of my personal favorites. He has also been on episode 54 and episode 143. So if you haven't caught up on the archives yet, you guys might want to check those out. In those interviews, we discussed a certain player named Bobby Fischer, who we will be discussing even more, among other topics this week, because our friend and guest of the show has come out with a new book that is rightfully drawing rave reviews, Bobby Fischer and His World. Aside from his work as an author, Mr. Donaldson is the captain of, or often the captain of the U.S. Olympiad teams. He's one of the preeminent chess researchers in the world. And of course, back in the day, pretty fierce player in his own right, as we'll also be discussing. So I'm eager to discuss his book and everything else new with him. So let's welcome him back to the show. I am John Donaldson. How are you?
Doing well, Ben. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to catch up, and sorry it took me a little while to read your book. I've been eager to interview you, but I wanted to give the book the treatment it deserves and make sure I was prepared to discuss it. And had read it, and of course it was a pleasure to read. So was looking forward to it coming out anyway. And of course we'll get to your book. But John, the news of the week in the chess world, of course, is the sad passing of Grandmaster Lubomir Lubosh Kavalek, who I know you were friendly with, and he comes up several times in your book and is even mentioned in the acknowledgments. So for listeners newer to chess, or maybe not new to chess, but just not that aware of Grandmaster Kavalek's achievements, what would you tell them about him?
Well, American chess has definitely lost a giant. I think one way first off, Grandmaster Andy Soltis is working on a piece for Chess Life for the March issue, and he's limited to 750 words for his article. And I don't envy his task, because Lubosh's accomplishments were so many that, you could write a couple books on him. But if you think about him as a player, one thing that immediately comes to mind is that he was a three-time U.S. champion. Another thing that comes to mind is that he played on 7 U.S. Olympiad teams, and 6 of those teams medaled, 1 gold and 5 bronze. The only team that didn't was the 1972 team, which was probably the weakest team the U.S. has sent to an Olympiad since before this ever, probably. I mean, maybe but 1930 or something like that. So Kavalek was a really good team player, but I think his single most important achievement as a player was the January 1974 FIDE rating list, where he was ranked number 10 in the world. And to put that in perspective, the number of American players who were rated in the top 10 while playing for the United States is exactly 6. Bobby, Hikaru, Gata, Fabiano, Wesley, and Lubosh Kavalek. Those are the only Americans that have ever been rated in the top 10 in the world. So that's pretty good company to keep.
Yeah, that pretty much says it all. And I should have mentioned in the introduction, by the way, listeners, you guys may have caught that in 2 episodes prior to this one in the feed, there is an interview between Fred Wilson and Lubosh Kavalek that Fred Wilson from his old archive, which is generally available on the Perpetual Chess Patreon page. But Fred graciously suggested I share it on the podcast feed in light of Grandmaster Kavalek's passing. So for listeners, if you didn't get a chance to listen to that, I definitely recommend you check it out. I mean, his English is fantastic. And of course, his memory of being involved working on the team of Nigel Short as he got ready to oppose Kasparov. And then they had a bit of falling out, as he discussed. And of course, working with Fischer in the second half of the match of the century. So there's so many great details in that interview. So definitely recommend listeners have a listen to that when they can. But John, what was your personal relationship with Grandmaster Kavalek?
Well, the first time I met Lubosh was in Estes Park in Colorado. That was the site of several U.S. championships. And in 1986, I was there as the second for Yasser Seirawan. And one evening, Yasser and Lubosh invited me to dinner. And we started talking about the upcoming Olympiad that would be held in Dubai. And perhaps some of the older listeners will remember that this was kind of a controversial Olympiad because assurances had been made early on that all members of FIDE could join and participate in this event held in the United Arab Emirates. And, FIDE accepted the invitation, the United States committed to play, and then all of a sudden, rather late in the day, it became apparent that Israel wouldn't be allowed to participate. And the result of that was that, American players were really divided whether they should go or not. And, for example, Alburt declined, Joel Benjamin declined. And while the U.S. Championship was going on, it was very unclear exactly who would be playing for the U.S. team. And so when we sat down to eat that evening, at a certain point, Lubosh asked me, what are you doing around the dates of the Olympiad? And I was, rated maybe about number 25 in the United States at the time. And the idea of being captain had never even entered my mind. So when he told me what was I doing during the Olympiad, I was like horrified because I thought, oh my gosh, so many people have declined their invitations to play in the Olympiad team that they're actually having to go to the bottom of the barrel and grab me. And Lubosh, he instantly saw the look on my face, understood what was going on, and started laughing. He said, "Don't worry, we're not that desperate." He said, "We want you to be captain, not to play." And that was a start of a wonderful friendship with Lubosh. And it couldn't have been a better start because we almost won that Olympiad. And that was the very last one that he played in. So that was quite special. And over the course of the years, we would exchange many, many emails. And he came twice to Reno to an event that's held every October. It's the Western States Open. It's organized by Jerry and Fran Weikel. And that was the last tournament, in fact, that he played, and it was in 1999. I mean, his career as a player really ended in about 1987, 1988 was the end of it. I mean, he still played in the occasional events here and there, but for all intents and purposes, he was no longer a full-time professional player. But those tournaments in Reno, I remember that we got to do stuff, make little trips and stuff besides the events. The second one, I should say, he gave a sign in, and that was in 2011, and that might have been his last, public chess display, if you will.
Yeah, although I saw in one of his obituaries online that he actually made an appearance in the Czech Republic in as recently as early 2020. It looks like right before COVID hit. So I don't know if we did an actual exhibition, but he at least was able to do a public appearance. Were you I don't want to get too personal about what befell Grandmaster Kavalek. I understand that it was complications from cancer, but do you were you aware of health problems, John?
I exchanged emails with him in late December of last year, and he wasn't ill yet. So whatever took him was very quick, very, very quick, and he was very much engaged in the chess world, and he was the same old Lubosh at the end of last year. So, it was very sudden.
Yeah, that's really sad to hear. And he, of course, was also the longtime chess columnist for the Washington Post and the Huffington Post. And I noticed that the Huffington Post archive, a lot of what he's written is still online. So as he discussed with Fred way back in 2003, he had some writing projects going on that, as far as I know, haven't been published yet, but you can still read his writing on Huffington Post. John, do you have any information about the projects that he might have been working on?
Well, I saw that Peter Dogger's obituary mentioned a long-running project that, tournament book for Montreal 79 This, of course, was one of the first great super tournaments, and he doubled as both a player and organizer. He, you know, did quite credibly in the tournament. He had a great second half after a difficult start. So that would be, if indeed, that's fairly far along, it'd be interesting to see that published. I also know that he published he worked as the editor there's a publishing firm, RHM, and they published a lot of great books. And one of them was a tournament book that he wrote called Vaikanze 1975. And it's really, really good. I mean, it really gives you insight of what was going on in the tournament. And it's one of my favorites. And RHM published a number of excellent books during that time period. One they didn't publish that they had planned was a book on Tilburg 77. That book was published in Czech in 2002, I think. But the English manuscript is somewhere around. That would be another one that I would love to see the light of day. But what I really hope is, Lubosh mentioned that he was working on some sort of memoirs, and during the COVID times, and so I don't know how far he got along, but he's a really wonderful writer, and a lot of his writings can be found in Chess Life in Review, as Chess Life was known then in the 1970s, and those are all available free online. The USCF has, made it possible to view them, and they were a combination of deep understanding of the game, opening erudition, and just wonderful stories. I mean, he's a very cultured man.
Yeah, I hope we can. I'll definitely have to dig into the online archive that US Chess graciously shares. And yeah, the obituary you mentioned by Peter Doggers is excellent. Definitely recommend listeners check that out as well. Before we move on to Bobby Fischer, John, could you just give us a little more sense of what his personality was like as someone who knew him well?
Well, the thing you have to realize about Lubosh is that I believe he was born around right before the end of the Second World War, and he grew up in Czechoslovakia when it was one country and not split in two, and they were probably not easy times. And his father, it's my understanding, is actually he had to escape the country, when the communists took over, and as a result, things were doubly difficult for Lubosh. But he won the Czech championship when he was 19, and but when the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, Lubosh realized that would no longer be his home, and so he left, and he settled officially in the United States in 1970. But he still always kept in contact with his old homeland, and so he was good friends with Milos Forman, the famous film director. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and I think Amadeus was another movie that he produced or directed. Also, Ivan Passer. All sort of Czech intellectuals he kept in contact with, and he spoke multiple languages. He traveled all over the world. He was just a very interesting person. Curious about many different things, and as a chess player, on the one hand, he was like a consummate professional. In the 1970s, most American players, they played in weekend Swisses in the U.S. Championship, but he was playing in many international events, and he played in the Bundesliga team competition for many years. At a time when there were no other American players playing regularly, internationally. So he was a very international person. I'd also say as a player, he was very much a chess artist, especially in his earlier days. His game, for example, against Gelfand from the student team championship, I think around 1964. Famous game. If you look and learn from the Grandmasters, the first edition of it, each Grandmaster was asked to select two games. One game that made the biggest impression on him, and their favorite game they played. And Gelfand, who lost the game, chose that as the game that made the biggest impression on him. And also from that Vaikanze tournament book, he played a brilliant game against Portage that was a draw that won the Brilliancy Prize. Those are two games of his that immediately come to mind. in his later years as a professional, he was more a little more technical, and he was a very good technician. He had very good end game technique. So I sort of think of this sort of duality. On the one hand, he was a real professional, but he was also like a chess artist as well.
Yeah, that Goofeld game is something special. There's I know Sam Copeland did a YouTube video. So however listeners like to take in a game, whether you're just playing through the moves or seeking out a video, definitely it merits replaying a few times, as Andy Soltis was quoted saying. And speaking of Andy Soltis, one thing you may or may not know all the details of this, John, but the famed story of Lubosh, how he emigrated using vodka to bribe some guards as he crossed the border. I know that this was written in one of Andy Soltis's books, as Peter Doggers mentioned, and he mentioned that Lubosh had written about it a little bit. It was one thing that did not come up in his interview with Fred Wilson. Are you privy to the details offhand about exactly how that all went down? Because it's an amazing story.
Yeah, it was a little bit before my time. It would have been I started playing in '72, and this was a few years before. So I don't really, I only know what I've read online. As far as that went. But I do know that it was a tough decision in the sense that he'd already played in the interzonal, he'd already played in several Olympiads, but still, and the Czechoslovakia, to be fair, it wasn't they didn't have quite the support that they did in the Soviet Union, but still, for a player from the East to come to the West, the life of a professional player was precarious, especially before the match in 1972.
Yeah, and then he pursued his education here in the U.S. Definitely showed a lot of initiative, and I'm glad that he managed to maintain a foothold in the chess world as such an incredible talent and a brilliant man who could have done many things.
Right. Well, I mean, one thing I also didn't mention was his organizational abilities, and those, the Grandmasters Association, the GMA that he was involved with. I mentioned that Montreal '79 tournament. He contributed to the game in many different ways.
Yeah. So listeners, definitely worth reading up and listening up about Grandmaster Kavalek. But I also want to discuss John's book, of course. So, John, I've got many questions for you about your brand new book. But first, let's take a break. In case you are not familiar with our friends and sponsors, aimchess.com, we wanted to take a quick break to tell you about what they do. What they do is they collect your games from Lichess or chess.com, your site of choice, and look for data-driven trends of things you can work on, such as converting an advantage, a specific opening, possibly tactics, whatever it may be. They create personalized lessons based on your games and even review positions from your games where you may have made a mistake. So I love the product, and there's a free version that you can check out. And if you like it, you can subscribe to Aim Chess. If you use the promo code CHESS30, you can save 30% on the cost, and they will know you came from Perpetual Chess. The details will be in the show notes, but for now, let's get back to the interview. So, John, as we mentioned, your book was already selected Chess.com 2020 Book of the Year. Congratulations on that. I've seen some great reviews online. And for listeners wondering, it is a combination of games and biography. I know that some people prefer each, to be honest, because there's some people who are always looking for chess audiobooks, for example, but there are others who feel like it's not a true chess book unless you can see some games. So it's nice to have the blend of both. And John, a few months back, I had esteemed author Frank Brady, another Fischer biographer, another of the most respected and preeminent Fischer biographers on the show. And I know that you guys are in contact, and he's in your acknowledgments as well. So having had that perspective recently on the show, and just sort of as a grounding point, one thing I was curious about is, are there any facts of Fischer's life that you and Frank differ on?
Well, first, let me take one step back, if I may. I was honored to receive that award from the chess.com, but, I must say that I looked at all the books that were on that short list were the best of 2020, and this last year was an exceptional year for. I don't know if it was because of COVID or the stars aligned perfectly, but the books by Boris Gelfand with Jacob Agard. There's a fantastic book on Smyslov. Just there were so many good books this last year. I mean, it was great I won, but it was probably because of Bobby.
Well, that's modest of you to say, but I agree. Those are also great books. And Stuart Rachel's book was really good. It was definitely hard to choose, but rightfully deserved. but that's nice of you to say.
Right. Well, I think one thing to keep in mind is that Endgame was written a while back, and so Frank may have adjusted some of his viewpoints that he expressed in that book. As a result of evidence that's come forward, in the last couple of years. And so I think one point where my book differs from Frank, but Frank might have a different opinion on that now, is the role of who was Bobby's seconds in Reykjavik. And, traditionally it was always held to be William Lombardi, and indeed Lombardi was one of Bobby's seconds in Iceland, but he wasn't the only one. And it's clear that Lubosh was the second, from game 13 onwards. And evidence of that can actually be seen in the writings of Lombardi himself. If you go back, there was an article he wrote about the match in, I think it was 1974. It appeared in Sports Illustrated. And he mentions how he and Bobby were analyzing the adjourned position from the very complicated game 13. And at some point around 2 or 3 in the morning, he said, let's call Kavalek. And to put things in perspective, Lubosh was not at the match for the first half. He was working for Radio Free Europe at the time. And the first half of the match was covered by Radio Free Europe by his boss, who was not a real chess player, but thought it'd be pretty cool to be in Reykjavik in the summer of 1972. So he only sent Lubosh for the second half of the match. So the way I see it is that Lombardi had tremendous contributions to Bobby's success in the match, if for no other reason that he persuaded him after forfeiting the second game to continue onward. That itself was, he earned his keep and more. But as far as the technical chess analysis, in the second half of the match, Lubosh would have been a better analyst at that time. He was definitely a stronger player. I mean, that's not any disrespect at all to Lombardi, but you can look at the respective ratings, and also the fact that Lombardi was he had his clerical responsibilities. He wasn't playing regularly in tournaments, and he was a last minute choice by Fischer to be his second. So definitely Lubosh being Bobby's second, that's one difference between my book and Endgame. But like I say, I think that in view of information that came out after Endgame, that Frank probably would acknowledge that the role that Lubosh had to play now.
Yeah, I mean, and as you were saying just before we started recording, you're struck by the fact that even in the course of writing this book, you're still making new discoveries about Fischer all the time. So I'm sure for Frank that feeling is magnified. Can you think of examples of new facts unearthed since the publication of this great book?
Well, I mean, fortunately, there weren't, at least to my knowledge, knock on wood, there weren't too many egregious errors in the book, but there were a couple small ones. And one was that I wrote in there that when Steve Brandwine played Blitz with Bobby around 1980, 79, that 81 maybe even, that Fischer was playing the black side of the poison pawn. And I mentioned that, this is not something that Fischer ever played in his tournament practice. Turns out that was not true. About a week after I sent it to the publisher, I discovered he actually played one game on the black side of the poison pawn in 1967 against Minich. And Lubosh, again, he kind of helped to put things in perspective. It turns out in 1967, the theory of the Najdorf, there was no real consensus as to what Black's best choice against six bishop g5 was at the time. And so even Bobby was kind of moving around trying different lines to play as Black. And that one time he played against Minich. Another thing that I made a mistake on was that I had the impression that Jackie Beers had pretty much dropped out of the chess scene, in the early 1970s, like another Fischer friend, James Gore, had. But in fact, that wasn't true. He was still playing here and there, and he played all the way into the mid 1990s. I'm assuming that he died around 95 because his record stops there in the USCF MSA. But I should have checked there. And also, he was a stronger player than I gave him credit for. It looks like he was at least 2100 plus and might have been a master at one point.
Okay. Well, as far as 630-page books go, if those are the only mistakes, I mean, I'm sure the principals involved appreciate your correcting it, but it could be worse.
Well, in terms of errors of fact, there are. I mean, a few little grammatical gremlins slipped in, but already it looks like the first printing of the book is sold out, and so I was asked to by my publisher to put out a list of errata and stuff. So I sent that. So hopefully the second printing will be cleaner, and it will also eliminate some of these little details that I should have gotten right.
Okay, because I did see a couple people in the Facebook chess book collectors group mention that they say they'll get their book in March or something. So that explains it. And your publisher, of course, is Silman James. So none other than Jeremy Silman is involved. Are you interfacing with him personally, or is he kind of hands off these days? I know he retired from his chess.com column.
Well, Jeremy's a dear friend and like 40 years standing, but it's actually his wife that is the driving force behind this, Gwen Feldman. And I'm eternally grateful for her for what she did for the book. I mean, she was the one. I gave her like all these photos that I had, discovered that were low resolution that I thought would just turn out like, just pure mud. And she managed to bring them to life. She also put together a lot of interesting illustrations. I'm kind of a visual person, and so I really appreciated some of the work she did there. Also, I've never had a book. I mean, I've written close to 40 books, of which most of them are modest sellers, shall we say. But I never had one that actually would lay flat properly. And one thing I really like about this book is that when I'm looking at it and I'm studying or playing over a game, it actually sits down flat and doesn't move around. And so I just really appreciate, she had a lot of good editorial suggestions, but just the visual feel of the book, I really appreciate.
Yeah, beautiful pictures and a beautiful book and a pleasure to read. And listeners, I'll just go ahead and tease now that at the end of the show, we're gonna do another book giveaway, as I did when I interviewed FM Andrey Terekhov about the aforementioned Smyslov book. But bringing it back to your Fischer book, John, we've got a couple listener questions, Patreon supporter questions. So I'd like to dive into the first one, which is from Matthias Plach. So thank you for the support, Matthias. And Matthias's question is, which of today's elite chess players is comparable to Bobby Fischer in style of play?
Oh gosh, that's really hard. I mean, times are so different now. You would think that the player that could be potentially the closest to him in style would have been Peter Leko, because Leko's the only world-class grandmaster I'm aware of who actually trained with Bobby. If you if you go to YouTube, there's like a short clip from I think it's from like a Chess 24 show that Leko did with Jan Gustafsson. And in there, Gustafsson says, I heard this rumor that like Fischer stayed with your family. And it was near the end of Bobby's, last days in Hungary. I mean, it was like around 1990 99 maybe. And the Leko family lived in Szeged in Hungary. And Bobby was, from what Peter said, frequently his guest. And they analyzed quite a bit. And Peter didn't come to him and said, like, today we're going to look at the Najdorf, let's look at this, and this line. He would just be looking at positions and just taking his lead from Bobby. But he was really impressed with his understanding. And I think I remember one anecdote. He described it being a very warm summer day in Szeged, and the temperature was close to 100. And there was, the air conditioning was modest. And Fischer dozed off as Leko was working. And Leko didn't disturb him. And then Leko kept analyzing, and he got to some very complicated position, and he was looking at it with a computer and everything. And then Fischer woke up and he said, "Oh, what are you looking at?" And then he started looking at the position. And after like a couple of minutes, he said, "Well, I think this is what the best play is for both sides." And Leko was kind of dumbfounded because he was spot on with his assessment of the position. So, Bobby's judgment was still good, in his later years.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. And yeah, I didn't send you that question in advance, and I did feel like it kind of put you on the spot a little bit. I mean, of course, there's the famous Miguel Najdorf quote about Bobby Fischer's playing style, that I believe is in your book, where he says, that's a longer quote than this, but where he says perfection has no style.
Right. Well, I think that all the top players today, you can see some of Fischer in them, in the sense that when he was at the top of his game in 1972, he had a very large opening repertoire for the time. In those days, players usually only played a couple systems with white and black, and for obvious reasons. I mean, they didn't have access to the computer databases and chess engines, and it was a much more difficult experience to learn a new opening system. And yet, Fischer, you could look at the match with Spassky, especially in the second half. He was kind of like a moving target with black, playing Piritzes and Elekines in addition to his Sicilians. And even in the Sicilian, he wasn't just playing the Najdorf, but in the last game he played the Taimana. Of course, today, all professionals have to play, multiple, weapons with white and black. And so in that sense, I think, the professionals today, Bobby anticipated them by 50 years.
Yeah, and had to work a lot harder to keep up to figure out the openings.
Yeah.
One more from Matthias Plock. He also asked, he said, would Bobby Fischer like to play in the Magnus Carlsen's Champion Chess Tour, or was he against faster time controls?
I think Bobby was perfectly okay with faster time controls. I mean, he loved to play blitz. And he was not only a really strong blitz player, but he was an exceptionally fast blitz player. And what I mean by that is that, even when he was playing, for example, in the famous Herceg-Novi Blitz tournament in 1970, in many of the games, he only spent 2.5 or 3 minutes. And that also explains that time differential, explains why when he was playing against Andy Soltis and against Walter Shipman. For example, Shipman was winning, and that was the one draw in the New York 1970 Blitz tournament was held for the grand reopening of the Manhattan Chess Club. Shipman, if you look at the final position, it's incomprehensible why Shipman would have, agreed to a draw, because he was winning in the position. But he was about to lose on time because, they didn't play with an increment. So Fischer had several minutes ahead on the clock against Shipman in that situation. So I would say definitely, I don't know that Bobby, I'm trying to think if he did play some 30-30 tournaments and game 60 tournaments, or 60-60 actually they called them, because they didn't have sudden death in those days. But he played at E4Log's Log Cabin Chess Club around 57, 58. He played in some of those events. Of course, they didn't have increment time controls, and they didn't have the plethora of rapid chess events. But I think he would be perfectly amenable to that sort of thing. I think he'd enjoy it.
Yeah, unfortunately, I do wonder how he would have handled, thoughts about people cheating if they're playing online, given his general concerns, some of them, justified, but the fact of not being able to see the opponents, I think, might have affected him, given how persnickety he could be about playing conditions.
That's certainly true.
Just a quick break to hear about the latest and greatest from our friends at Chessable.com. Of course, the big news is that they have released the much anticipated iOS app for your iPhone or iPad. I checked it out and it runs very smoothly. Great way to review your openings or your endgames or whatever you are working on. There's also some new offerings from Chessable, including Lifetime Repertoires Part 2 for C4 and Knight F3 by IM Christoph Selecki and FM Karsten Hansen. The Chess Toolbox 2 is out. And of course, if you want to get your Bobby Fischer fix, apropos of this interview with IM Donaldson, there's always my great predecessors by world champion Garry Kasparov. That's all for now. Let's get back to the interview right now. So there's so much stuff from this book, John, that I could ask you about, but I did just want to try to highlight a couple of stories that I think listeners might find of particular interest. One of which, you quote at length this great essay by Lou Hayes, which I believe was also or similarly quoted in American Chess Magazine when they did a special Bobby Fischer issue where he talks about the role that he had in arranging Fischer's rematch with Boris Spassky. And in that, there's a story of Fischer possibly playing your old friend Yasser Seirawan. So being that Yasser's so beloved by chess fans, I thought they might be interested in hearing more about that.
Well, Yasser's one of the few, children of Bobby, if you will, players that started playing in 1972 that actually saw Fischer and spoke with him. The only other player, of Fischer's children that actually did, and only just very briefly, is Larry Christensen. Of course, for a later generation, Alex Scherzer, American Grandmaster who was very strong in the early 1990s, he lived in Budapest in the 90s, and he actually spent a considerable amount of time with Bobby. But in the case of Yasser, I didn't really, this is, of course, before the match in Sveti-Stefan that they would have made the arrangements, because Lou's only talking about things that happened before that match. And I don't really know the details of it. I'm not that aware of how far things got along. But I will say this, just as in 1972, in 1992, that match easily could not have taken place. And one of the people who really, deserves credit for making it happen was Lou. I mean, both he and Bob Ellsworth, really made it possible for Zita to visit the United States, and she made sure that that she and Bobby felt comfortable. And I think that without that matchmaking, if you will, that I don't think there was any way that Bobby was going to ever go to Yugoslavia to play the match.
Yeah. And I mean, just as a Fischer fan, setting aside your work as a researcher and biographer, are you glad that he played those additional games, John?
Well, I am. I mean, I think the first thing is that I'm glad because they provided him financial stability that he had been searching for a long, long time. And I also am glad in the sense that it gave a lot of people a chance to see him one more time. I think that when one judges the quality of play in the match, it's very important, as I mentioned in the book, to keep in mind the time control they were playing with. And, it was the first time really that the increment clock had been used, and they were guinea pigs, if you will. And one thing they definitely underestimated was the length of time that some of the games could go. And so I mentioned in the book that, normally professional players at that time, they were used to playing a 5-hour session. They would play 40 or 45 moves in 2.5 hours, and then they would adjourn. Well, of course, we don't have adjournments now, but that was the model that was used. And oftentimes you would play a couple days in a row in the tournament at this tempo, and then you would have a day set aside for adjournments. But this match in 1992, there were no adjournments. And so there was the one game that a lot of naysayers point out where Fischer really looks bad, and that's the Queen End game where he's a couple pawns up and he doesn't win it. And certainly he didn't play very well in the technical phase of that game, but you have to keep in mind that I don't have the book in front of me here, but I want to say the game went like 8.5 hours at a stretch. And if you look at all the great world champions, whether it's, from Alekhine, Capablanca, Botvinnik, even Karpov and Kasparov, they never had to play a single session game anywhere near that long. And I think, if you see Bobby at the post-mortem, when the press is interviewing, he just looks exhausted. He just looks like, he's just ready to collapse. So I think that's one thing that's important to keep in mind in the match, that definitely that time control had an adverse effect on the play. I think also that, it's true that his openings were a little old-fashioned by the time, 20 years had passed and he hadn't kept up to date quite as much on opening theory. But you can still see a lot of examples of his old brilliance. And I think that, obviously he's not going to play in his 50s as well as he, or he was around 50, as well as he did 2 decades earlier. But still, he played very strongly. And I think that, it's interesting what Subtle say that he says, yes, I mean, he's older, but his positional and strategic understanding of the game has definitely improved. And so on balance, I'm glad he did play the match.
Yeah, I mean, with Bobby in particular, the counterfactuals are always tough because it's always a mixed bag. I mean, certainly he had other opportunities to make money, but that was the one that he found palatable enough to pursue, or as you mentioned in the book, was motivated enough to pursue due to his love interest. So we've got another Patreon question, John. This one you already touched on, but there might be even more to hit upon. So this one is from Joe Salmon. So thanks for the question, Joe. And Joe asks, he says, I'm interested in Bobby as an instructor or teacher. Did he have prodigies, and how did they go? Did he secretly second any players?
Well, I mentioned the Leko. That's the most prominent example. And keep in mind that when he worked with Leko was already like either in or on the verge of being in the top 10 players in the world. So that would be one example. But another was a player who did become a grandmaster, Michael Bezel. He's from Germany, and his father operated a inn in, I believe, in Bavaria. And Bobby spent several months there. I'm not sure whether it was before or after his courtship of Petra Dautov. I think she was Petra Statner then. But at any rate, he did work with Bezold, who was chosen, as certainly as it's right to be private about his relationship with Bobby. But it would be interesting to know, one's very curious how, Bobby mentored him. What did he think was important? Because we have some other clues of what Fischer might think of it, in terms of how he would have been a teacher through his old boy's life columns. But those were, different lifetime. I mean, those were in the late 1960s. One thing that he mentioned, I think, to one idea of how to improve was to pick up a copy of MCO.
Right.
And then just go through it from beginning to end. I think Frank Brady mentioned this. And then
and I had asked him about that. Yeah, Frank, one of Frank's famous stories. It's it's funny because no one would give that advice now.
Right. But I think, one thing that I only sort of discovered and sort of really, I knew the information, but it just hadn't percolated through in my brain, was, why would he have maybe offered this advice, which, as you say, is kind of, not the way that pretty much any teacher today would recommend. And I can think of two possibilities. One, of course, is that he was taught that way by his first chess instructor, Carmine Negro. And the thing you have to realize with Negro is that, he worked with Bobby from the early 50s all the way up into 1956 when he moved to Florida, was that he was very much a latecomer to the game. I mean, he didn't learn to play, that is, Negro, or Nigro, till he was in his late 20s. And he still got to be, USCF rated expert, which is, quite a good achievement. But Nigro was a very much by the book kind of guy. And the books that were available then were, MCO and Practical Chess Openings by Fran, and Chess Middle Game book by Fine, and Basic Chess Endings. And he used those books with Bobby and just kind of drilled them on those. And I know this because Carmine's son, Bill, who's referred to as Tommy sometimes, he told me this. And he showed me, because he still has these books in his personal library from his father. So I think that influence could be one reason. Another is that John Collins, he produced, with Walter Korn, but I think he played the major role. He produced MC09. And so again, that would have been in the late 50s, I believe that came out. That could have been another book that he used with Bobby. But yeah, I don't recommend that for anybody that's listening. I mean, there's definitely better ways to go about trying to learn how to play.
Yeah, I mean, as I sort of alluded to when I talked to Frank, I mean, the main thing about Bobby, and certainly struck in reading your book, is just his voracious appetite for chess. I mean, which, as you mentioned, he continued throughout his life, despite his not competing as much. He still just read everything he could get his hands on.
Right. I mean, there's that famous interview that originally I think first appeared in No Regrets, where Bobby was in Argentina, I think, to promote his version of Chess 960, and he visits Juan Morgado, the famous correspondence player's bookstore, and for Bobby, it's just like being a kid in a candy shop, and he's visiting old friends like the Tournament Book of San Remo, and he's looking for new books, and at a certain point, some of the other customers that are there, who are obviously sort of starstruck, they press upon him some gift of some obscure Argentinian correspondence magazine, and Bobby looks through it and he says, "This is a serious magazine. These are annotations to the games." So he was very much like Elekine in that he would pick up useful information in any way, shape, or form wherever he could find it. And that was a character throughout his life.
Yeah. And John, for any listeners wondering, I've seen this question come up a couple times online, and I know you've addressed it. I can personally say, having read a lot of the prior Kindle books that you wrote about Bobby Fischer, that there were only one or two instances where I recognized something. But how did you weave together your prior research and publications on Fischer and this, which is kind of like the magnum opus?
Three of the ebooks were very, the format was very clear for them. One was dedicated just to the tour in 1964 that he made around the United States, Legend on the Road. It's appeared in print form a couple times, but this was like greatly expanded, maybe double the size. Another one was dedicated to his writings, and for example, one thing I could really advise readers to do if they haven't done already is to go to Chess Life. Around 1963 or so, he was a very frequent contributor to the magazine. It was edited by a fellow by the name of Joe Reinhardt. And Bobby would come around to the USCF office, which at the time was located at 80 East 11th Street. And Fred Wilson was also in this building, as was Albert Bushki, the great book dealer. And Reinhardt would basically sit down and he would just take notes and type up exactly what Bobby said. And he gave Bobby carte blanche to write about whatever he wanted. And one of his subjects was the match Steinitz played against Italian player Dubois. Completely obscure match. And Bobby spent several, issues of Chess Life, must have been about a dozen pages giving his commentary on this match, from a modern perspective. So I would say that, that, and then I think the third ebook was related to Fischer's non-tournament games. I tried to reconstruct, for example, the simul tour he made of Argentina in 1970 after the Petrosian match. So those three ebooks, which could be a subject for a future book, a physical book, they were very, very clearly structured, very obvious format. But the other two books were a mess, because what happened was, since about 2008, I was doing research for this project, and I was constantly finding new information, and sometimes this information would directly contradict what I learned before. So it was almost, in a sense, it was almost worse that I did these ebooks and then at first I tried to make them, into a physical book, but it didn't really work that way. I ended up having to rewrite a large amount of it, both to reflect, new information to come in, my changed interpretation of some events in his life, and it was. I really thank Gwen also for kind of helping me to steer through that. My advice, if I had to do it all over again, would just be to do all the research and wait to start doing the writing, at the very end, because this way it was almost it made it very tricky.
Okay. And I know Jesse Cry from Chess Dojo, Grandmaster Jesse Cry, when he interviewed you, he was mentioning how long you've been working on this book, how you've been declining social obligations for a decade now because you're so ensconced in the Fischer research, which again, it definitely shows in the book. So is this project put to rest, John, or is there more to come?
Well, there's always more to come with Bobby, and maybe some reader out there could solve this mystery for me. One thing I'm very much concerned with is, all things Fischer, all of his, his personal artifacts, all of his, things related to him. My dream is that someday, as I mentioned in the book, that they'll all somehow ended up at the World Chess Hall of Fame in St. Louis, which, by the way, has a lot of Fischer memorabilia, a lot of it. In fact, it is by far the best, public institution in that regard, bar none. And there have been some really great exhibitions the World Chess Hall of Fame has done, and much of that material is available online at their website. They do a really good job of archiving their exhibitions. So even if you couldn't be in St. Louis at the time, you can come back now and see it afresh. But there's certain things, I know that, for example, David DeLucia, as I mentioned in the book, he's done a magnificent job of rescuing many of Bobby's treasures, and he has put many of them in his books. In fact, he and his daughter have two books dedicated nothing but Bobby. And for a researcher who is looking for primary source material on Bobby, those books are fantastic. I know also that Larry Finley, who found a whole bunch of Fischer memorabilia at a flea market shortly after it was auctioned off, he has some of Fischer's treasures still remaining. But there's still a lot of other stuff that's unaccounted for. And DeLucia got much of his material from Palbenko, because what happened is that around 1999 or 2000, after Ellsworth had tried to buy up a lot of the material that had, from the storage locker that had been auctioned off, uh, there was the Snyder family. Harry Snyder was Bobby's very good friend, and he was his physical trainer. They had met through the Worldwide Church of God, and Snyder's son took many of the items that Ellsworth was able to get back from the auction, and he took it personally to Budapest. But you recall that around 99 or 2000, Fischer, he didn't, he left for Japan. He spent a lot of time in the Philippines. But to my knowledge, after about 2000, he never came back to Hungary. And so his possessions were entrusted to Palbenko, and I think some maybe possibly to János Rigo, the Hungarian IM who recently passed away. And fortunately, those items have not, they were not thrown away. They ended up with dilution. And so, that was a very good thing. But the thing I'm wondering if your readers can help me on is the following. In the early 1960s, there was Bobby sat down and he was sculpted by a Yugoslav artist. And you can find this online. There's an image of it. And the question is, what happened to the sculpture? And here's what I know so far. The first thing is that the counting of this artwork, Serbian sources, says that Svetozar Gligoric brought it to the United States in 1963 and gave it to Bobby. And it looks like it's really too big to transport, but according to Harry Snyder's widow, this sculpture, the image you see in the photograph, shows a work in progress, and it was actually trimmed down, if you will. And so it actually fit in, like a roller bag. And in '63, Gligoric, of course, played in the Piatigorsky Cup, but that was in Los Angeles. I mean, it's conceivable that the flight to LA transited New York, and Bobby picked it up then. But Gligoric didn't just play in the Piatigorsky Cup. He also played in the U.S. Open that year, and he also played in the New England Open in Massachusetts that September. So now we're getting much closer to New York, and he could easily have flown out of New York. So I'm confident that Bobby got it. Then Bobby moves in the late 1960s to Los Angeles. So you're wondering, like, well, the sculpture, like, did it survive? And it looks like it did. And I base that on two facts. One is that in some of Fischer's extremely hard to listen to rants that he gave in those radio interviews, they're just so painful to listen to, where he's detailing all of the possessions he lost. He mentions a bust of himself. And then to further confirm it, Sarah Snyder says she distinctly remembers her son bringing it to Budapest. So think about that sculpture. It went from Serbia, from Belgrade to New York to Los Angeles to Budapest, and now I'm wondering, what happened to it. It was a very nice work, and I'm curious where it went to.
Yeah, if any listeners have any information, that would be amazing to come across. The mysteries never end.
Another mystery I have is James Gore. Gore was a very strong master. He was like, at least 2350-ish, and maybe even stronger. And he was said to have been a very close friend and a very big influence on Bobby in his formative years. The last we know of Gore is that when they had that Blitz tournament I mentioned earlier at the Manhattan Chess Club in 1970, it was I want to say maybe August. It was after the match with 71. It had to be, because it was after the match with Larson. So it was 70. Yeah, 71 it would have been. After that match, they had this Blitz tournament, and Gore played in it, And that's the last I've ever heard of James Gore. I mean, it's not an uncommon name. There are several James Gores still listed in New York. He could still be alive. I mean, it's quite possible. It'd be very interesting to hear from him. Of course, the biggest trove of Fischer material that's not readily available to the public is at the Marshall Chess Club, and that's all these game scores that again I'm not exactly sure the history, but I believe it's as follows. In the fall of 1960, Regina moved out of the apartment at Lincoln Place in Brooklyn, not far from the Brooklyn Public Library in Prospect Park. And when she did so, she knew she was going to be gone for a couple of years. She was going on a peace march for nuclear disarmament from San Francisco to New York to London, all the way to Moscow. And I could imagine that she quite correctly thought the idea of leaving all the family records with a 17-year-old Bobby was probably not the prudent thing to do. And so I would imagine that she gave them for safekeeping to her daughter and to her son-in-law. So Joan and Russell Targ were given them. And then they moved from New York at some point in the 1960s to Northern California, near Stanford and Palo Alto. And they likely, like many people that have family records and things like that, they put it in the attic, and it sat there, for a very, very long time, until sometime in the last decade. Russell Targ very generously donated the items to the Marshall Chess Club, and so what they consist of is all things Fischer. So a lot of it was the basis for Joseph Ponoroto's psychobiography of Bobby Fischer. It talks about the Fischer family history. For example, one thing we learned from this was that from these records is that Bobby's grandmother died in a mental institution. Very, very sad. There's a lot of family information that's available there. But for chess players, what's really the creme de la creme is that there's 100 score sheets, and 50 of them, as I mentioned in the book, are really just kind of plain vanilla. They're carbons that Bobby was given when he played in grandmaster tournaments. As is typical for most events of that type, there would be a original score sheet on top. There'd be a carbon below. The original goes to the organizer, and the carbon goes to the player. So those score sheets, don't really add a lot to chess history. I mean, the only thing that's interesting about them is to check. Occasionally, you'll see a game that's in, either the book by O'Connell or Wade, or more recently the Karsten Muller book, which is a collection of all Fischer's games, and there'll be a discrepancy in the move order in a game. But what's really special about this is there's 50 games that Fischer played from roughly 1955 to 57 that have never been published. There are games from the Matulovic match that he played as training before the Arizona and Porto Rose. There's games that he played from domestic tournaments in the United States, training games he played against Anthony Sadie and Jack Collins. Some of those games I do have in the book, only because I was able to get them from another source. For example, John Collins, his papers are at the library in Bloomington, Indiana, and that had some really, really, it had some photos and it had some game scores I haven't seen anywhere else. So hopefully one day, those games will, see the light of day. I understand, and I explain in the book some, the challenges the Marshall as a nonprofit institution that has to think out for its survival. How they have to. It's a difficult situation that they're in, but hopefully one day those game scores will be available, because they're not just like junky games. Bobby was already like 2,300 ish player for most of them. It's stronger in some cases.
Wow. Huh. Yeah, something else to look out for. So I just had one or two more questions on the book, John. One thing I really liked is that you get a lot of sort of contextual information about like American chess history in particular, whether it be like the Latvian diaspora, the Karklins and Victor's Popels, and all of the strong Latvian players that made their way to the U.S. and sort of had brushes with Fischer. And I love the essay you excerpted from Jerry Hankin, who was kind of a well-known chess columnist, in the 90s that I used to read regularly. And I didn't know that he had started chess as an adult, or around age 20, I believe, if I remember correctly from your book. And that got me thinking, obviously I interview a lot of people, John, who achieve a lot of chess improvement as an adult. And there were several that came up in your book that I wasn't aware of. And as sort of like one of the leading experts on US chess, I was just curious who you can think of as like the people who achieve the most rating wise, who learn chess like after the age of 20 or around the age of 20.
Well, in the case of Rubinstein, he learned to play a little bit earlier, but he certainly got off to a late start by today's standards. He was probably like 16 or so. But that didn't stop him from obviously being number 2 in the world at one point behind Lasker. I know that I've read that Mihai Shuba, the great Romanian grandmaster, yeah, he didn't start playing, if I understand correctly, until he was in his 20s. There aren't too many examples, to my knowledge, of modern day players who started so late. It's funny, you have to put in perspective. For example, like Magnus, he, if I understand, learned to play. He learned the rules of the game when he was about 5, but I don't believe his first tournament, he was about several years after that.
Yeah.
And playing your first tournament at like 9 now, you're like an old man.
Great.
So yeah, I trying to think of somebody I know who, Abe Turner would be one example of a player. He didn't learn how to play until he was an adult. He came after the Second World War. And Turner, who I described, I mentioned in the book, he had a lifetime plus score against Bobby, and he was certainly 2,400 plus FIDE. So Turner, who suffered a very, tragic end. He was murdered by a fellow employee at Chess Review, and he's definitely one person that springs to mind.
Okay, yeah, maybe I'll we can brainstorm more and try to come up with some more names, because
I'm sure there are some cases, but that I mentioned, for example, that Nigro, became an expert when he started playing when he was about 30 years old. And that sounds like a very modest accomplishment. But for anybody that's learned to play as an adult, that's really good. It's really good. It's very, very difficult. I remember once Alex Shabalov, gave a talk at the Mechanics Institute, and he stressed the importance of learning to play young, that that it was such a more natural process, that, as he put it, gradually the cement starts to harden in your brain, and the learning becomes that much more difficult.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, becoming an expert as an adult is a great achievement. Okay, John, we're going to take another break and hear from our friends at chessmood.com, and we will be right back. Perpetual Chess is happy to be brought to you in part by our longtime friends but new sponsor, chessmood.com. If you didn't catch episode 192 with their founder, GM Avtek Gregorian, you should listen to it to see what he's about. Chessmood is a subscription-based website with courses covering opening repertoires for white and black, covering middle game mastery, end game mastery, and more. They also have lots of free content, such as a Chessmood blog with written features by grandmasters about stuff like chasing the 3000 blitz rating and how to improve your chess and your mental game. They have on YouTube now daily lessons with the grandmaster that you can check out and subscribe for free. So there's lots to check out, and I'll put all the links you need in the show notes, but the bottom line is go to chessmood.com and have a look around if you have not already. Okay, let's get back to the interview. And we are back, and John says he has just thought of another accomplished adult improver. So, John, who did you just think of?
I thought of Bernard Zuckerman. He doesn't meet your strict criteria, but one way to describe the beginnings of his chess career is that he was born in March of 1943, like Bobby Fischer, but he was a few weeks younger. And as he describes it, Bobby Fischer was U.S. champion before he had actually even started to play. So I don't think Zuckerman started to play until 1958-ish or so. And despite that handicap, within a half dozen years, Zuckerman was playing and making a plus score in the U.S. championship. And I know that Bobby at one point was interviewed in the early 1960s by some Soviet chess journalists, and they asked him, what American player is really impressing you, is really making fast improvement these days? And he pointed to Zuckerman. And I should just say that for any of you listeners that are not familiar with his name, he's arguably one of the very strongest American players never to become a grandmaster. I mean, he's like 2,500 feet, but more so than his playing abilities was his just knowledge of the game. He was a tremendous scholar. People, Zook the book, they call him for his knowledge of opening theory, but his understanding wasn't just limited to the openings. He had a very profound knowledge of in-game theory. He just had a tremendous chess culture, if you will, and he was one of the very few people that Fischer would really talk chess with in the 1960s. And he was one of the few people that Fischer would play blitz with, because he was one of the few people that could actually, give him a game, if you will, in the United States. Zuckerman, even up until the early 1990s, I think he was playing at Susan Pogart's place in Rego Park. He was a terrific blitz player. And so I think he's a good example of somebody who, despite a late start, showed that it was still possible to make a huge improvement.
Yeah, there's so many examples. And I wish it were all tracked and documented in a more comprehensive way, but it's good to have people like you to lean on in the meantime, John. So one other topic that I don't think we've talked about much in our prior interviews, John, is your time publishing or co-editing with Yasser Seirawan, the illustrious magazine Inside Chess. So it's probably going to be before a lot of listeners' times, but could you just tell us a few highlights of that experience and how you reflect on it these days?
Well, in the late 1980s, I think it was about 1987 in the fall, Yasser Seirawan, who I've known since I was from my earliest days in chess in 1972. We both grew up in the Pacific Northwest. He lived in Seattle and I lived in Tacoma. So we've always known each other, and I was honored to be his second when he won the World Junior in 1979. And I went to many tournaments in the late 70s and early 80s. He conceived this idea to have a new magazine. And to put things in perspective, there had been a precedent. There was a magazine that came from Los Angeles called Players Chess News. And it existed in as a sort of like an oversized newspaper, if you will. And there were two editions of it. One concentrated on recent tournaments, and there would be annotated games, and there would be cross tables, and the other was devoted purely to theory. It was called Theory and Analysis. And these two publications had a number of well-known chess players working for them. For example, Grandmasters Larry Christensen and James Tarjan were both editors at one point. International Master Jeremy Silman was an editor. Another was Vince McCambridge, who's also on my short list of like the strongest American IMs never to become a GM. He was like in the high 2400s VA for quite a while, and stopped playing relatively early. I also served as a editor at Players Chess News, but by the end of 1987, it had gone belly up, and it had been struggling for some years. And what Yasser envisioned was something more ambitious. It would be a combination of recent chess information. It would have feature articles. It would have book reviews. It would have theoretical articles, and it would come out every 2 weeks. And that's the schedule it began with in the beginning of 1988. And I must say that this was really a very generous thing of Yasser to do from several respects. First, if you want to become rich, don't start a chess magazine.
Yeah, it's a polite way to put it. Yeah,
but he did provide the livelihood for a number of individuals over the course of dozen years. Also, if you want to become the very best possible player you can be, if you want to, be a world championship contender, don't publish a chess magazine. Yasser quickly became an expert on second-class mailing permits. And, but Yasser decided, that, he didn't want to just live in Europe and just concentrate on his chess. He wanted to see American chess develop, and he wanted to do what he could do to promote it and be part of that. And so he chose to base himself in the United States, although I think his career as a professional player, was sacrificed to a certain extent as a result of that. The magazine, I think, was very well received, and they had contributors from around the world. But gradually, as the internet became a more powerful presence in people's lives, it became a bit problematic, to justify for everybody in the country. They're getting their first magazine is going to be Chess Life. That's part of their membership in the federation, and then for many people in the country, a regional magazine in the Northwest, for example, it was Northwest Chess, is their second magazine. So this was like the third magazine, and remember also that this period that it appeared also overlapped with New in Chess. So it was really it was becoming more and more difficult to justify it, I think, financially. But what I can say is that the issues are available. It had a pretty good circulation, so loose issues are floating around pretty much everywhere. And it was also, I think, Hannon Russell, when he bought out Yasser's stock, I think he did he scanned all the issues, and so I believe they're available digitally as well. That could be through Chess Cafe. Now, I'm not sure exactly, but what I can say is that certain parts of that magazine can still be read with great interest. I would say that the opening theoreticals could be safely skipped, but the game annotations by Yasser were really, really first rate. I would say that for people interested in chess history, the interviews were usually quite good. But there was also a couple columns that were outstanding. Alexander Baburin had an in-game column that has not really aged, and Nikolai Minev had a tactics column, some of which were made into a book, but some articles were not there. There's a place on the web called it's like the Chess Library. It's done by Phil McCready, and it's a testimonial to Nikolai Minev, who he was Minev's student, and I think all the articles that Minev wrote, or at least a number of them, are on that website, and that would be a good place for anybody who's looking for material on sharpening their tactics to go to, and it's free.
Okay, good stuff. Yeah, my subscription as a kid was on and off, John, but the Shahadis got it. Mike Shahadi had a subscription, so I would always look forward to grabbing it when I was at their house.
Yeah, no, I have fond memories. At that time, Yasser was often a visitor to the Shahadi home when Greg and Jen were growing up. He actually did a series of chess videos for a guy called Stan Nakamura and he produced those while I was in Philadelphia. So he lived in Philadelphia at my parents' home. Yasser did for a bit. My father was the director of the Philadelphia Zoo at the time.
Yeah, I worked at the zoo as a teenager, so I knew that, but somehow I didn't know that Yasser had lived there.
Not in the zoo, mind you, but in my
right. No, I know. Right. Yeah, not in the zoo.
Yeah.
Good stuff. So, John, last time we talked, we also touched a little bit on your playing. You were, at least were, like a lot of us, you had some ambition of getting back to over the board. Obviously, no one, for the most part, has been able to do that in the past year. But now that this book has been published, do you have any thoughts of getting back to OTB play when it's permissible?
Definitely. Right now, I'm still finishing up a couple small projects. One thing I was entrusted with over the years was a number of dear friends who passed away. They gave me their chess archives, and a lot of interesting materials, a lot of interesting photos and writings and obscure regional magazines. And so I'm in the process of trying to organize and deciding which would be like good candidates to donate to the World Chess Hall of Fame. I don't want to just, I feel kind of embarrassed. Some of these people passed away like 5 or 10 years ago, and I want to make sure that these treasures that they safeguarded, that they are preserved. And so I'm down to it. It's like maybe another month of this. But I have signed up my dear friend Mark Pino. He asked me to play in the U.S. amateur team, so I will play in the U.S. amateur team West, online event that's coming up like in about 10 days. But Mr. Weasel, I'm a little bit nervous about my play, and I don't play online. So, but for Mark, how could I say no?
Wow, yeah, even venturing into the online waters, I commend you, John. I'll play Blitz online, but I'm not bothering with the tournaments. But I am looking forward to playing OTB when that becomes completely safe. So obviously, you've written many books in addition to your chess history work on opening theory. So how do you keep up with, I mean, I know you've been busy with this project, but if you were to study now, how would you adjust for modern times? What would your routine be like, John?
Well, I think one thing I have to acknowledge is the fact that, I haven't really played regularly. I've played occasionally for like the last 10 years. But they're mostly like in regional tournaments, where opening preparation isn't that critical. Multiple games in one day, pairings put up a few minutes before the round starts. But obviously, if one wants to be more ambitious, catching up to date on opening theory is near the top of the list. I think for most of your listeners, that especially those below 2,000, that shouldn't be where their priority lies. But that regrettably is, when one has to deal with that at a certain level. I think also a thing I would definitely be doing every day is spending, at least an hour studying tactics. And there's so many good resources out there now. I think the only real choice that listeners have to make is that there seems to be sort of like two types of tactics books out there. And when I say books, I realize that I'm counting like electronic works in that rubric. I would say that for less experienced players, they really benefit from having tactics books where there's the first few pages of each chapter introduce the theme, and where there's some prose explanation, and then it goes on to the exercises to solve. I think for more advanced players, they could go straight to solving the exercises. But I think for those that are on the way up, that they were better served by the books that have part explanation and then exercises. And there's a new one out by Thinkers Publishing that's by a young Hungarian grandmaster who I believe is a student at Webster. His name's escaping me. Prochaska, I think it is.
Yeah, and, Peter Prochaska. Yeah.
Okay. And
I don't know how to say it, but yeah, I know who you mean.
Yeah, and that that also it seems to be to me a kind of a fascinating situation now. I mean, the guy's like, I don't know, maybe like 26, 30 or something like that. FIDE, he's a very strong player, and he's not even 30, but he's wanting to, write and teach. These days, times have changed. I think from a practical standpoint, I think that unless you're like, I don't know, maybe like 2,700, trying to drive your livelihood from just playing is pretty problematic. And 2,700 might not be the right number. Maybe 2,750 is, especially with the pandemic, that it's become, even more of an issue because they don't have all the team tournaments they played in the past as a resource to keep one's head above water. But I see like he's not the only student at Webster that's doing this. I saw that Krikun, I think Yuri Krikun.
Yuri, he's been on the show. Yeah, right. He's prolific.
So again, and he's I think even younger. I think what it points to is that it seems to me that both writing and teaching are becoming more professional in the sense that the standards are being raised constantly, and you're getting more people involved that are ambitious, that really want to do a good job. And I alluded to earlier that the list of candidates for the best books for 2020, and it was no modesty on my part to say, I mean, there's like, I look at, there's so many good books that were published this last year. I mean, it used to be like maybe, one or two good books would come out in a decade. And then it was like every maybe couple of years, a couple good books would be published. But nowadays, it's like a torrent. And I'm talking about non-opening books for the most part. Opening book standards are obviously much better than they were in the past, but they tend to have a much smaller shelf life. My favorite publishers are, Quality Chess has to be like number one, but all of them are getting better and better. Thinkers Publishing from Belgium, New in Chess, Everyman from England. In the United States, Russell Enterprises, they published the first book on Smyslov, and there were a couple other books just recently that came out that I thought that were pretty good as well. You're sort of spoiled for choices now. So in terms of like what my training will be is, I'll definitely, try to improve my, refreshing my tactical ability and try to do a lot of endgame studies. So, sharpen my calculating ability, and I'll try to look over my opening repertoire. And I'll also try to be going through like these two new books by Boris Gelfand. But it sounds like, I could easily spend, 5 or 6 hours a day, so we'll see what's possible for an old dog.
Yeah, well, it would be well deserved to spend that time after the magnitude of this project. So dare I ask, John, do you have another major project in mind? Are you writing a Fischer follow-up? Are you going to focus on your chess? What's other than sorting through the things that were passed along to you that you mentioned? Do you have an idea of what your next major project will be?
Yes, I think it will be with on this one. I'll work with Eric Tangborn, my longtime friend, who's an fellow international master from the Home Chess Club, and we'll be trying to put those ebooks that I mentioned, the other three, the Fischer's writings, his tournament games, if you will, and try to bring those to life and try to preserve them as well as they can be. I mentioned that Fischer wrote a long-running column for Chess Life in the early 1960s, but he also did annotations for other magazines that kind of appeared here and there. I remember he annotated a game for the Israeli magazine when he played in the Tanya in the late 60s. And he, he did other annotations here and there that are interesting. I mean, anytime somebody like at that level writes about chess, it's good stuff. That reminds me, one thing I wanted to mention, because we mentioned we talked about, I'm just trying to go back to what we said exactly. We mentioned Jerry Henkin, and we also mentioned, his relationship with Bobby in the early 1960s. And now that I hear about it, I mentioned Netanya, which is where he played in the late 1960s. It brings up a theme. The theme is this. And basically, the question is, when did Bobby go over to the dark side? And what I mean by that is, when did Bobby sort of develop his fascination with, anti-Semitic topics? And I've read a couple of places, Donner and I think maybe Pal Benko. They mentioned that, Fischer was reading, Adolf Hitler related literature, even in the 1950s. But I think that Henkin explains it much better. He explains that it wasn't so much that Bobby was anti-Semitic at the time, say, for example, of his match in 1961 with Reshevsky, because I don't believe he was, and Henkin doesn't either. I think he was more sort of fascinated with Hitler as a personality and kind of grabbing onto power. And that makes sense, because then when you go to the late 1960s, how else to explain Fischer playing in a tournament in Israel and spending a week at a kibbutz? It doesn't make sense that if what his position was in the late 50s, translate to a decade later. I think that his feelings that he had, when he sort of went to the dark side, I think it was in the 1970s. I don't think it was when he was a kid growing up.
Okay. Yeah, it's hard to pin down. I mean, he was the whole Church of God thing is foreshadows his deeper dive off the deep end later. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to say.
Right. It's definitely complicated. And of course, nobody's, internally consistent 100%. I mean, that would be asking quite a bit. But in his case, I would say he's more complicated than most people. And there's, of course, also the issue of how he deals with people individually and how he deals with the world at large. And individually, he had many Jewish friends, and he, that was true throughout pretty much most of his life. But his worldview definitely changed over the course of time. That was for sure.
Yeah. Okay, well, John, I think we can leave it there. So is there going to be, just for listeners wondering, obviously the paperback book, as you mentioned, is being reprinted. It's a pretty substantial paperback book. Is there going to be a Kindle version?
I believe that Gwen Feldman, my publisher, Silman James, who published all of Jeremy Silman's books and also Jennifer Shahadi's Chess Bitch, there will be an ebook at some point. I'm not sure exactly what she has in mind, but there definitely will be. And I should also say that my book is also good if your triceps are slightly soft. You'll find that it's very useful for doing curls. And also, if you have any drafty state areas of your home, it works as a great book stop as well.
Yes, yeah, 630 pages strong, but I enjoyed every page of it. And John graciously sent me his book. So as I teased earlier, listeners, we're going to do another book giveaway. This time I'm going to give away 2 books. So here's how it's going to work. And by the way, I should mention, in the Terekhov interview, the winner was Scott from British Columbia. Thank you to everyone who wrote the reviews. About 10 to 12 of you sent me the reviews as you were instructed if you chose to participate in this contest, sent me a screenshot of the review, but a lot of reviews popped up that no one sent me anything. So if anyone wrote a review and didn't email it to me but was intending to participate in the contest, you can email me, ben@perpetualchesspod.com, with that review to enter this book giveaway. And also repeat, you can enter again. As I mentioned, you can do a review more than once. And this time we're going to open it up beyond Apple Podcasts. I want to shamelessly court positive reviews everywhere. And by the way, you can say negative things as long as you give me 5 stars. So I don't mind. I don't mind if you're negative, if you give some constructive criticism, but it has to be disguised with the precious 5 stars. So anyway, write a review on any platform other than YouTube. A YouTube comment doesn't cut it. And mail a screenshot to ben@perpetualchesspod.com, and I will announce the winner via emails, or the winners, on February 14th, I believe. Somewhere February 16th, somewhere in that neighborhood, and then I will announce it on a subsequent show as well. So John, sorry to make you sit through that, but we got to buy a couple of your books after all of your work. So try to get them into the chess community. And John, you mentioned, of course, that there's still a few facts that you're trying to track down. So if anyone wants to reach out to you with some information or just some feedback, what's the best way for them to do that, John?
They can send me an email to the following address: imwjd@aol.com. And the IM is for International Master. And my first name is actually William, as my father and grandfather were, but I've always gone by John. So it's International Master William John Donaldson, imwjd@aol.com.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, and I'll drop that in the show description as well. John, and I think that's everything. Thanks as always. I always learn so much talking to you, and congratulations on an excellent book.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me, Ben. And one last thing I can say, that Terekhov book on Smyslov, it's really, really good, and I can strongly recommend it.
Yeah, likewise. I always, as you were alluding to, John, I mean, a lot of the authors you've mentioned have been on the show. I always feel like I'm raving about their books. Like, I feel like listeners might think I'm grading on a curve or something, but everything's been so good lately that it's that I speak from the heart when I lavish these books with praise, including your own.
Right, and I can say, you mentioned, but I would second it also. Stuart Rachel's book, I really enjoyed reading it. It brought back a lot of memories. I knew Stuart when he was a kid. I actually was a second for him and Patrick Wolf at the World Junior in Adelaide back in a different lifetime. And so I was really glad to see him do that. And I hope there more, grandmasters and international masters write books of that type.
Yeah, and I've got to try to track more of those people down, more of the people who may not be fully immersed in chess right now, but have some amazing stories. Okay, well, John, it's been a lot of fun. Got to tend to my children, so have a good day, and congratulations again.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks again for having me.
Thanks, as always, to my producer, Matthew Passy, and to everyone who helps spread the word about the show, telling your friends, writing positive reviews on podcast platforms. All of that stuff helps. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm @BennyFisher1. Join the Perpetual Chess Facebook group. You can find the link on the website, and we are back in action on Instagram @Perpetual Chess, sharing a weekly clip from the podcast. So follow us over there as well. But of course, the main purpose of these credits is to thank everyone who makes the show possible by their financial support. Without you all, Perpetual Chess would have ceased to exist a long time ago, and for that I am forever grateful and work to continually improve and expand the offerings from Perpetual Chess. So without further ado, I would like to give extra special thanks to the following people and entities: Chessable.com, David Lazarus of LazmanChess.com, Quality Chess Books, the Capital City Chess Club, the Abysmal Deaths of Chess blog, Adapta Interactive Web Designs and Services, the Apprentice Twitch channel, Andrew Alharji, Andrew Bach, Aniti Deer, Austin Clough, Benjamin Porteau, Bill Sigler, Kathy Carr, Chad Oliver, the Charlotte Chess Center, the Chess Central's chess blog, chessmood.com, Chris Flanagan, Chris Lott, Dan O'Hanlon, Daniel He, Danny Davidson, David Schreiber, Derek Jones, I am Dimitri Schneider, I am Eric Rosen, Eric Tam, Ewan Richardson, Farhan Thawar, Faraz Sawaf, Gary Forman, Glenn Downing, Greg Harfst, Greg Shahadi, Gregory Gulick, Guven Manet, James Kennedy, Jeff Martinson, Jens Green, Jeremy Nielsen, John Jernigan, John Rockefeller, John Cromarty, John MacArthur, Kelly Palmer, Kevin O'Callahan, King Selt, Lucio Casada Silva, the law offices of Stuart Katz, Matthew Feeney, Michael Cann, FM Michael Oblin, Mike Zelazny, Mr. Mike Shahadi, the famous Mr. Dodgy, the Nerdnaze Twitch channel, Peter Sodi, the Playmore Chess Academy of the Hampton Chess Club, Reuven Fisher, the Seattle Chess Club, Shane Unger, Stephen Kelty, Stephen Martinez, Thomas Stanix, Thomas Tachenko, Todd Bryan of StrongChess.com, Todd Kennedy, the Vintage Patzers, which is a Chess.com improver group, Wayne Beam, William Hogarth, Aaron Waffler, Ace Viega, Adam Ralph of ChessEngland.com, Adrian Gutierrez, Alex Pejas, FM Andrey Terekhov, Dr. Andrew Perry, Barry Hessian, Bill Juniper, Bill Moran, Brad and Andy Rosen, Brett Howard Lynn, Brian Mullis, Bruce Scott, Brian Tillis of Palm Beach Chess, Chad Hilton, Dr. Charles Snodgrass, Chris Wainscott, Christopher Baumgartner, Christopher Chabris, Christopher Wood, I am Christoph Zalecki, aka Chess Explained, Coach J's Chess Academy, Corey Budson, Costa Chorus, Courtney Fry, Craig Mallon, Daniel Ginsberg, Daniel Naylor, Dave Saylor, David Bleskacek, David Brown, David Hamlin, David Cramley, Dalen Shelton, Dennis Parrish, Dirk Decker, FM Donnie Ariel, Douglas Matthew, Dwayne Edmonds, Ed Daly, Emmanuel Langlois Robitaille, Ethan Smith, Hallelujah Cat, Ian Mason, Indrick Ryland, Felipe Melo Pereira, Fox Valley Chess Club, Francis Latarte Lavoie, Dr. Frank Torres, Frank Zananis, Gary Andrews, Gary Lewis, Geert Vanderveld, Gene Stewart, Gerard Barta, Giovanni Russo, Hans Schut, Harish Srinivasan, Howard Vihan, Jacob Kovacs, Jacob Turan, Jacques Perry, James Aspinwall, James Banastia, James Muir, Jason Willem, J.G. Chakrabarty, Jeff Anderson, Jeffrey Martello, Yep Hoyland, Jerry Wells, Jim Ratliff, John Tully, Juan Almaguer, Dr. John Fallon, John Fernandez, John Fontaine, John Hartman, John Jeffrey, John McMurtry, Jonathan Slater, John Tully, Jose Rodriguez, Justin Gardner, WGM Jen Shahadi, Joel Rocky, John Thompson, Grandmaster Josh Friedel, I am Kare Christensen, WGM Katerina Nemtsova, Kelly Palmer, Kevin Boyce, Kevin Pryor, Kior Gata of the Lakeshore Chess Club, I am Kostya Kavutsky, Krishna Gopala Krishnan, Kyle McAvoy, Larry Ryforth, Laura Belyovsky, Macaulay Peterson, Mark Miller, Martin Knudsen, Martin Krug, Matthew Passy, Matthew Tedesco, Matthias Plock, the Mechanics Institute Chess Club of San Francisco, Michael Allard, Michael Hudson, Miguel Aristide, Mike Clem, Mitchell Fabian, Nate Salon, Neil Bruce, Nigmat Mulajanov, Nicholas Isabel, Olaf Mueller-Michaels, GM Pascal Charbonneau, Passy Passanen, Paul Bain, Paul Clarkson, Paul Sweeney, Paulo Santana, Peter Lux, Randy Tempo, Ricky Grijalva, Richard Hallenbuck, Robert Tichy, Robert Turner, Rory Coleman, Roy Yearwood, Ryan Berg, the Say Chess YouTube channel, Scott Doherty, Scott McKinnon, Sebastian Finsterwater, Walder, Shane Unger, the Silver Knights in Richmond, Stefan Roller, WGM Tatyev Abrahamian, Tim Brennan of TacticsTime.com, Tim Seymour, Timothy Ha, Tom Edsel, Tomas Komanich, Tony Rotella, Tyron Price, Vishnu Srikumar, William H. Brock, William Juniper, William Peterson, FM Zhao Cheng of Chess1000.com, and of course, Zhivko Stoyanov. Thanks for listening, everyone. We will be back next week with another episode of Perpetual Chess.